This is Easter Sunday. Easter is always, to me, the most exciting part of our Christian year. In the Gospels, the birth of Jesus is only recorded in Matthew and in Luke. But in all four Gospels, the death and the resurrection of Jesus are so important that each of them tells a story. Marcus Borg, a well-known theologian, said one time, "Many of us are sightless in a world of miracles." Those actually weren't his words. He took them from a Jewish prayer. Most of us are sightless in a world of miracles. I guess the challenge for all of us is to try to open not just our eyes, but our lives to the miracle that God gave us in Jesus Christ. When I was a pastor, I remember how anxious I would become as we approached Easter Sunday. I would think to myself, there are going to be people in the church building for worship on Easter who don't come any other time of the year. So I was anxious because I thought to myself, now what am I going to say? How am I going to couch this story in a way that is going to bring these people back every Sunday to church? I want you to know that never happened. The people who were there for Easter, I saw them maybe at Christmas and the next Easter. There's also something egotistical about that. What am I going to say? How am I going to say it so that people who are sitting out there can hear the story and say to themselves, this is something to which we commit our lives? I probably would have been better served to read Paul's account in 1 Corinthians of the resurrection of Jesus. One of the things we need to understand is that the New Testament, the Bible, is not written in chronological order. The first four books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels, they were actually written after the letters of Paul. 1 Corinthians was probably written in about a little after 50 AD. The Gospels, Mark probably the first, not written until about 15 or 20 years later. What Paul was relying on was his own experience with Christ, as well as what was handed down to him. We know that the church didn't write down the story early, but they told the story, and the story was circulated. And when it got to Paul, maybe Paul forgot the parables of Jesus because we don't find a single parable in Paul. Do you think Paul forgot the Sermon on the Mount? there's not a single word of the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, the one thing we find in Paul is the emphasis on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Paul is saying, if that event didn't happen, everything else is worthless. If Jesus didn't come out of that tomb and appear to people and show himself to be alive, you and I, we couldn't rely on just stories or good sayings or parables. We have to rely ultimately in our lives on the fact that Jesus died for us, was buried, and then was raised and appeared to people. Paul said, last of all, he. And that's what made Paul an apostle. An apostle was somebody who was to see Jesus, who saw Jesus in person. And Paul said, I've had that experience. And so I am an apostle. It's interesting how Paul shares the story of the resurrection. Paul does it by saying, I want to remind you. I want to remind you of something that you already know. I never will forget the title of Tom Long's book, Memory and Hope. Paul is saying, I want you to remember. I want to remind you. I want to remind you that Jesus died and was raised. I want to remind you that Jesus then appeared to people. In fact, lastly, to me. I want to remind you that if we only had one miracle to see in the Bible and in our lives, it is the miracle of Jesus breaking the bonds of death and the church shouting, He is alive. If we didn't have that, I think it's wonderful that Jesus raised the man by the pool of Bethsaida. I think it's wonderful all the people that Jesus touched and gave sight and opened their ears, and all the people to whom he gave life. But if we didn't have Easter, we wouldn't have anything to celebrate the other Sundays of the year. That's the miracle. And the Jewish prayer says, too many of us are sightless to the miracle. Do you know what I want to do this Easter? Do you know what I want each of you to do with me? I want us to remind ourselves of the story. He's alive. I want us, each of us, to remind ourselves of the greatest miracle of all. And if it weren't for what we do this Easter Sunday, we would have no hope. As it is, we have all the hope in the world. Amen.